Welcome, everybody. And thank you so much for coming to this event about regulatory fixes and other ideas about online mis and disinformation in political advertising is what we're looking at tonight. And online political adverts are only a very small piece of a huge question about political speech, which when we think about online mis and disinformation, we think a lot about political speech and what can be done about that that's still consistent with the First Amendment. And of course, as our elections draw near, we're all thinking about our dysfunctional campaign system in the US and all the things that are wrong with it. And there's been so much work done on what we should be doing about campaign finance reform and making voting more accessible. So online political adverts are only a small piece of it. But it's a piece that I started to get really interested in actually several years ago after hearing Ravel speak about the Honest Ads Act. And the more I learned about online political advertising in the US, the more shocked I became because I didn't understand that so many of the laws that apply to newspaper advertising or television political adverts don't actually apply to political advertising online. And I thought that Ravel's approach was just a sort of super common sense, let's find low-hanging fruit that we can all agree on and really start thinking about how we can get a grip and just, knowing who's spending the money and what are their interests and cracking down on foreign interference. It all seems so common sense. So I got more and more interested in the subject and I began reading more and more about it. And this panel for me is really exciting because it actually brings together my very, very favorite people, thinkers, and solutions around the question of online political advertising, something I spent a lot of last year thinking about. So even though we all hate not being in a room together, or we're all sick to death of COVID, the one advantage is getting these incredible speakers in one place. So I will just introduce, I'm very bad at introductions, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. So I think one thing when we think about online political advertising, just in the last few months, we're starting to see all these interesting practical solutions coming out. And so this panel really represents some very different perspectives. Nathalie Marechal, who's a writer and a researcher and an activist who works on internet policy and human rights advocacy, is a senior researcher at Ranking Digital Rights. And she works with Rebekah McKinnon, who many of you know and has come to SIPA many, many times, a real friend of SIPA. And Nathalie and her colleagues wrote a very interesting paper that came out a few months ago on the importance of banning micro-targeting and arguing that that would actually really, really help solve the political advertising sort of messaging problem. And Ravel probably disagrees. And is a former chair of the Federal Election Commission, former Santa Clara County Council, and former chair of Fair Political Practices Commission in California. And Anne is right now actually running for the 15th district seat in the California Senate and just has years of sort of hands-on practical understanding about our American electoral system. Rebekah Tromble, I only met for the first time at a conference. Can you imagine what it was like actually going to a conference? But I'd been following Rebekah's work for years and really, really excited by the work you've been doing called Virtual Insanity, which looks a lot at disclosure of online political advertising and what we can learn from Europe. And you've been working with, I think it's Civic and just doing a bunch of really important reports. And I do worry that because of COVID, a lot of this stuff, the work that you've all been doing has just not been getting the attention it should be getting and would be getting in a normal world. If that's, if such a thing exists. Now, Jamal Watkins is the Vice President of Civic Engagement at the NAACP, leading the association's efforts to maximize the African-American community's participation and representation in our democracy. I've learned from email that you were a philosophy major as well, so you may break out into a little Rawls or something else. But the other thing is, many of you know, because I talk about it all the time, I finally finished my PhD. Well, I didn't finally finish my PhD, I finished my PhD. And I had a whole section on what a great idea advertising boycotts would be and why they probably wouldn't work. So when I saw over the summer the work that Jamal Watkins was doing on the Stop Hate, I just can't even tell you how thrilling and exciting that was to me. And especially because since regulation is so hard to do in our country at the moment, it just a sort of common sense, practical boycott that hits at the financial incentives of the big tech companies to put a lot of stuff out there, I thought was really, really clever and just very exciting. So delighted that you'll all be talking about your ideas. Oh, and I forgot to mention that today was the launch of my own report, which basically takes all of what you're doing and then adds a really small little suggestion, which is a sort of public good, voluntary fairness doctrine news feed that the platforms would have to do. And I can talk a little bit about that at the end. They've sort of started to do it already, but that just builds, basically my report builds, sort of describes everything that you've all been doing and then builds on it with a few little additions at the very end. So thank you all for coming. Maybe Anne, would you like to go first and just tell people, you know, what is the Honest Ads Act? What's the case for updating it? And then maybe Rebekah could add on about what we can learn from Europe and disclosure, and then we'll go with Nathalie and Jamal. Thank you so much. I'll mute right here.
Thank you, Anya. And am I unmuted? Yes. Got to check these things, of course. Thanks for the introduction, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with everybody. So the Honest Ads Act was introduced in 2017, early on, when it became very obvious that there was massive Russian intervention, and intervention also, we know, that was native born in the election, and a lot of it was clearly political, clearly intended to affect the election, and many people believe that it actually did have that influence. In particular, and I know we want to talk a little bit about micro-targeting, but in particular because there was so much micro-targeting that was done especially to Black communities and other communities of color, but especially Black communities. And it was also targeted to swing states. And it's quite clear, at least I believe it, that it had an influence on the election. And so Amy Klobuchar introduced it, and it passed in the House. And it's also been kind of re-upped a little bit in HR 1 that was also introduced at the beginning of this Congress. But the concerns that I have with the Honest Ads Act, I mean, the whole purpose of the Honest Ads Act was to prohibit foreign interference, because the laws are not clear now, even in other than online ads, but in all ways. And it also proposed ways to address the disinformation. And some of that was to include what are called issue ads that are already part of the law, which require some disclosure prior to an election, which are not exactly the ads that you normally think of that specifically say vote for or vote against a particular candidate or a measure, but instead they are clearly related to an issue of legislative importance, and they also relate to candidates and are clearly talking about them. For example, in 2016, there were many issue ads that dealt with the very issues, and there are still today, the very issues that Trump was pushing then, in particular anti-immigration, the rights of gun owners and things like that, that were legislative issues of importance. But I see that while those changes are really good and really necessary, and we do need to address online ads in the same way that they're addressed in other media already, and that the US Supreme Court has upheld, what I see as a problem is that you can't necessarily just translate what's done in a regular campaign versus what actually is done on the internet and on platforms. Because we know, for example, that Russia, when they began their communications, did it in 2015, a full year before the election, maybe even more earlier. And so issue ads, as they're defined, are similarly defined in the Honest Ads Act, and they are 60 days prior to the general election if they're aired, and 30 days prior to a primary. And that would not be applicable to the kinds of issue ads that we now see that are certainly political, certainly done to influence the election. Also, I mean, I really do believe that because of that, we have to be more clear about the definitions of what is a political ad, because they are defined in the Honest Ads Act as being paid on a platform, when in fact, we know the Chinese and the Russians are not going to be paying Facebook for ads anymore because they were caught. Really, the way the ads are done is they're either placed in what appears to be organically because they hire people locally to put them on and look like organic ads or the like. And so those definitions have to change to be more all-encompassing to what we're actually seeing. And there should be ads considered to be ads that where they're paying for bots. They're not as much in use as they used to be, but where they're paying for algorithms, or they're paying to produce the ads, or they're paying to get it higher up on the watch, the list, but also paying for the micro-targeting and using people's personal information, all of those things in order to micro-target them. So all of those things should be included in a cost and what it really means to pay for one of those communications online. So that's generally, I mean, there's other issues that I think we know now are being used more. Fake accounts and placing things in the dark corners of the internet in groups that don't get shown on. They also, Honest Ads Act required that there be these lists of all the ads on the social media, and yet many of them have done it, but they don't have inclusive lists of these kinds of ads. And so they're failing to provide what people need to know who's trying to influence the election.
I remember, Anne, you're talking early on about why don't we have a know your customer? Banks have to know who their customers are. How can it possibly be that Facebook is taking money from people and then saying, well, we don't actually know who they are?
Exactly.
And obviously all this work that's been done by people like Laura Edelson has showed how the ad libraries are so inconsistent. And that was one of the things I thought that was so terrific about the work that Rebekah Tromble has been doing, is that you had really good, solid advice for the tech companies. Another thing, Rebekah, and then I'll turn it over to you, that struck me as I was reading about this is, and especially for our international students, I just wanted to underscore that our elections in the US go on and on and on. It's totally different from the parliamentary system where all of a sudden you call the election, you can have a snap election, and it's just a couple of weeks or even, or months, right? So our election period goes on forever. So there's a really long period of time in which you can sort of put out these ads or political messages. And precisely as Ravel says, it's not clear necessarily whether it's paid or not. It can still be influential. We have a longer run rate. And that's obviously contributed to a lot of the problems we have in this country about excessive spending, right? I'm just rereading Juliette Caget's book, The Price of Democracy. We're having a panel on that next week. And, the amount of money spent per person in the US is just out of control on campaigns. Rebekah, please.
Yeah, so Anya, I think that you set up the comparison or the contrast between the US and European environments in an important way, and particularly because you ended on the point that spending in the United States is just, it absolutely dwarfs what we see across Europe. But let me back up for just 1 second and give a bit of broader context to the research that I've conducted and the issues that I continue to look at more broadly in online advertising. I'm currently at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs, but I've only been there for the last year. And before that, I was for 8 years in the Political Science Institute at Leiden University in the Netherlands. So I spent a lot of time while in the Netherlands working on and thinking about some of these very issues across Europe, looking at the Dutch case in particular, but really looking at these issues all across Europe, including the vast majority of European Union member states. And one of the things to keep in mind here is that the European Commission has been very, very interested in the issue of micro-targeting and the potential for the spread of disinformation through micro-targeting on online platforms for some time now. And they took up this issue despite the fact that there isn't a great deal, at least compared to the US environment, there isn't a great deal of spending on political advertisement across Europe. But still the concern was that this would be one easy way for bad actors to spread disinformation throughout really important elections, both at the national level and at the European level. So the first step that the European Commission normally takes when they're looking to potentially introduce new regulation is to begin with a voluntary approach. And so they did just that just over a year ago. They introduced a code of practice that was developed in collaboration with a number of the key platforms themselves. And essentially the platforms voluntarily agreed to a number of self-regulatory measures. Key among those was that Twitter, Google, and Facebook all agreed to set up ad libraries. And the idea here, of course, was that they would provide transparency. They would provide access to basic information about what was happening on the platform in terms of political advertising. And crucially, it wasn't just classic political ads that might come from an individual politician or from parties, from campaigns, but it also involved political issues, so-called issue ads. So the broader idea was that the platforms would provide all sorts of information to the public, to journalists, to researchers, so that they could look more closely and interrogate what was actually happening on the platforms. Well, as soon as these libraries began to be implemented, a number of us, among the research community and journal libraries themselves, and the sorts of information that these libraries provided. And what we found very quickly and very clearly was that the platforms themselves, the libraries themselves, were incomplete and unreliable. When we did simple tests like query for the same keywords from different IP addresses in different countries, we got very different results. When we searched for the same thing at different points in time, we got different results, right? So this is, let's take the Facebook ad library just as an example, right? This would happen within the same library. But then we also more closely examined the sorts of information that was available across the libraries. And what was really, really important that stuck out to us almost immediately was that within this voluntary framework, the platforms effectively got to define for themselves what each of these things meant, right? What a political ad means, what a social issue, what an issue ad actually means, what sort of information they would make available, what they would hold back. And so there was huge discrepancies across the platforms in terms of the basic types of information they made available. And then if you just look at the technical systems themselves, right, none of them was ideal by a long shot. But for as much flogging as we tend to do of Facebook, they probably stood up the best technical system. Lots and lots of problems with it, but all in all, looking across those three, They set up the best technical system overall, whereas Twitter had by far, right, the largest problems with their technical system. So it's no surprise to me that shortly after a lot of the work started coming out, a lot of the research that a number of us were doing across Europe started coming out and being particularly critical of Twitter's implementation of this. And as then policymakers, right, were starting to increase pressure, that Twitter made the announcement in the United States, it got the most play, but Twitter made the announcement that they were simply going to ban political ads. Now, of course, the problem with this, and Google made, right, the same decision, the problem with this is there isn't a clear distinction between a political and a social ad. And the minute that you ban political advertisements, you just shift incentives for these people, these organizations, these groups to approach advertising in a different way. And a lot of these things, and we can get into more specifics in the details, I don't want to drag on here for longer, but one of the issues with straight out bans is often that they actually wind up having perverse effects and disadvantaging the little person, right, or the little organization with fewer resources that doesn't have the ability to gain the kind of organic reach that the bigger, right, organizations with all of the resources to organize can achieve. So my takeaway from examining these things in Europe and in the US, my two big takeaways are twofold. One, we need very clear definitions and standards. This is directly in line with what Anne was saying. And two, we need to think carefully before really advocating for straight out bans. Like I said, happy to get into many more details about that later.
And we're going to have a chance, I hope our nice big audience, thank you for coming, will be putting questions into the Q&A as well. That'd be great. Nathalie, I think you do believe in a ban, right? Don't you believe in banning micro-targeting? And I've always been tempted by that. No, can you tell us about your report and what you think is?
Yeah, so that's really overstating Ranking Digital Rights' position, I think. So we published actually a two-part report series this spring, focusing on how U.S. policymakers should approach the regulation of social media platforms and big tech giants. And we deliberately set aside the question of antitrust, largely because that is not our area of expertise, and that is something that other people are much better positioned to speak about. So keep in mind that what I'm about to say should be taken in the context of antitrust investigations and antitrust enforcement moving forward at its on current pace. Perhaps even, moving forward at its current pace. So our main focus with this report series was to demonstrate to lawmakers on Capitol Hill in particular that while the social harms that they are rightly concerned about with online content in general manifest at the content layer of the internet, that solutions at the content layer itself, such as regulation of content, which of course is largely unconstitutional in the US, but is nonetheless something that is very appealing to a lot of policymakers, such as putting a lot of faith in improvements in algorithmic content moderation and so on, was just not going to be sufficient, right? That content regulation, first of all, is just not particularly productive for the most part. There are niche areas where it is useful and appropriate and constitutional, but that by and large, that is not where the solution lies. And that while improving content moderation is essential, that alone is not going to solve the problem. And so that was the bulk of our first report that came out in March. The one intervention at the content layer that we do think is useful is what we call process transparency. So, and this is something that many companies are engaging in on a voluntary basis to an extent. So far, the companies have been relatively transparent. They've been improving their transparency from one year to the next, and that is a good thing when it comes to user content. But there's virtually no transparency about advertising content, surprisingly enough. Now, most companies do share their rules for what content is and is not permitted in ads. That's something that they need to communicate to their advertisers, and it makes sense to them to make that that information publicly available. But a pilot study that we did last winter found that none of the US companies we looked at disclosed any useful information. There was a little bit of like vague information, but nothing actually actionable about what kind of targeting was not permitted, much less how they actually enforced any of the rules related to paid content. And that's really striking when you compare the much more significant level of disclosure that they have around their processes for moderating user-generated content, right? In addition to that, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, mostly from journalists who've run experiments trying to buy ads, primarily on Facebook, but they've tested other platforms too, to see like, oh, if I try to buy an ad on Facebook with blatant COVID disinformation, are they going to catch it? And sadly enough, the answer was no, they're not going to catch it. Kaveh Waddell at Consumer Reports tried to buy and succeeded in buying a series of really blatant COVID misinfo ads that were all accepted within minutes. Now, he's a responsible person, so he took down the ads before they actually ran and were displayed to anyone. But they stayed in the queue at Facebook for well over a week, I think it was, before he pulled them, and they never actually found these ads that they claimed were their number one priority of when it came to advertising enforcement. So there's clearly something wrong going on when it comes to how well companies govern advertising in general on their platforms, right? And so that's one thing. That we need a lot more transparency about how what the rules are, how the processes work, what the outcomes of these enforcement processes are, and so on. The second part, which we discussed in the report that you mentioned, Anya, the May one, focuses on two elements, and I'll focus more on the first one, but I'll mention the second as well. Then the first one is federal privacy legislation that is robustly and strictly enforced. And that's a question and I think that's maybe where you got the sense that we were advocating for a ban, and it's not so much a ban on micro-targeting as it is a rights-based limitation on what data can be collected about people in general, right? And then the uses to which that data can be put. And that, of course, will very much limit what kinds of micro-targeting are possible, but it's not quite the same thing as an absolute ban, right? And then the second part of our proposed solution involves corporate governance reform. So these are things like requiring companies to separate the roles of chairman of the board of directors and chief executive officer, right? Because the role of the board of directors is to oversee the CEO, and you can't hold yourself accountable. That's just not a thing, right? Maybe when it comes to diet and exercise or something really personal, but in my experience, that doesn't work very well either. So, so separating out those roles, phasing out the types of dual share class stock structures that mean that no matter how many ordinary and institutional investors vote in favor of a shareholder resolution, the CEO can just ignore it because he or she, but mostly he, happens to own a controlling share of the company. And I mentioned the fact that it needs to be robustly enforced because there's a lot of pending court cases as far in Europe as far as interpreting specific provisions of the GDPR. Some people like Max Schrems argued that the current way that Facebook, Google, and others practice micro-targeting is in fact illegal under the GDPR. I think it'll be a matter of years before we get any kind of a final court ruling on that. But the reality is that GDPR is under-enforced because the data protection agencies in all the member states are underfunded and under-resourced. And so regardless of how specific provisions of GDPR end up being interpreted, it is nonetheless true that that there's rampant under enforcement of the law as it exists. And so I think as the US hopefully is able to consider federal privacy legislation in the next Congress, that enforcement is something that we should look to just as seriously as we look to the content of the law.
I agree with you completely. And it does feel like in this country, we don't have the setup that they have in many European countries, right? I remember when I was doing an interview in Brussels, one of the regulators there just sort of said to me in this, gorgeous, thick French accent, we're not like you Americans. In Europe, we know how to enforce and we know how to fine and we know how to punish these companies. I just thought, yeah, in the US, if we do get any of this legislation passed, it's going to be a huge, huge heavy lift to make sure it's actually implemented.
So
sorry?
They're not enforcing GDPR all that well in Europe either. So
okay, well, does that make me feel better or worse? So I think that leads us really, I think that really leads us nicely to Jamal, Watkins, and the work that you've all been doing, because do you think maybe the boycotts and the Stop Hate are a faster way of just getting to the same end? I'd love to hear sort of all about what you've been doing and where it's going next. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me into this critical conversation. And as I think about where we are in this moment, I'd be remiss not to lift up that the NAACP as an organization is a 111-year-old institution that is powered by volunteers. And so when we think about our work is pretty much rooted in the notion of catering to a constituency and what's the impact on the real lived experiences of the communities that we serve. And so I say that because part of Stop Hate for Profit, which was started, if you will, when our president and CEO in part taking note of what was happening around the extrajudicial killings, saw statements, both a tweet primarily from the sitting president that said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And so part of his outreach as president and CEO was to the head of Facebook to say, can we actually remove that from the platform? That ends up being, and what we equated it to in our community, it's similar to the notion of you have the right to freedom of speech, but yelling fire in a crowded theater, think about those consequences. And what we got was a response, if you will, from the leadership of Facebook and the platform. And so, joining with, American Anti-Defamation League, Roger McNamee, Jim Steyer from Stanford, and a few other organizations, Color of Change, we realized that we had to do something to pivot to, how these platforms play not only into hate that's happening in a racialized way, but what does it mean in the political context? Now, I would be remiss if I didn't lift up the fact that our team, of course, did some research, and our teams across both, private sector and public sector really asked the question, where do Americans fall along the lines of supporting social media companies in terms of political ads and regulations? And, we found that it was a survey back in 2018 that from Pew found that about 6 in 10 of social media users felt that it was unacceptable for these sites to use the data in a way that was linked to political campaigns and messages. And I think on the 24th of this month, new research has come out that says 54% of Americans feel the same way. And so when we connected the dots, what we realized is that Facebook and these platforms are wealthy, they're huge. And so we're not gonna make a dent in their profitability or their profit margins, but PR matters. Who you are as an organization matters. Your employees feeling good about coming to work and working matters. And so Stop Hate for Profit ended up being a $69 billion dent, if you will, in parts of Facebook's infrastructure. We had about 1,100 organizations that leaned in. And what we realized in this moment was that, yes, Facebook made a series of concessions like creating a VP of civil rights or releasing an audit and taking down some offensive groups, but not enough. We saw the shootings and killings in Racine, Wisconsin, where it was linked to a Facebook group that was organized and had hundreds of complaints that had never been taken down. And so when we think about the work that we were doing, Facebook lost, the projections we saw are about $56 billion in value when we started the campaigns, when brands came off the platform, but it recaptured that value in weeks that followed. So it was a dip, if you will, but it was about PR and messaging. And, you know, Mark Zuckerberg being interviewed and grilled on Capitol Hill by members of Congress also stepped up the notions. But we still continue to see what I would consider to be fake news. You know, for example, we saw the rise of the notion of George Floyd faking his death, and that being shared and reaching 1.3 million people, or that George Soros, you know, another George, who was apparently behind all of the protests and was really being lifted up in the Facebook platform. And so I say all of that because our analytics really leads to a couple of things, and this is what I'll wrap with. You all saw the story breaking on Channel 4 in terms of Cambridge Analytica and the whole deterrence factor being used by the Trump campaign, if you will, to suppress votes. And it really does put us in a quagmire in that our organization, the NAACP, and organizations like ours, we use micro-targeting. We use voter files, we look at data, but we don't use an approach that's about disinformation, misinformation, and voter suppression, because that brings us back to the days of, you know, the Jim Crow era with the poll tax and confusing voters, the things that we have fought to outlaw and sort of purge from our society. So philosophically and morally, having a platform allow for that to happen, while it does raise questions around freedom of speech and the rights of a corporate entity and what does it mean in a ecosystem that is online. But what it does say to us is that if the intentionality is designed to basically suppress the vote and to, you know, thwart political participation in a full way, then there's something wrong with that, and the accountability has to be built in. There has to be some type of decency standards, if you will, that are built in. And then, of course, looking at some forms of regulation. Now, I don't want to speak fully for any organization and say political ads are bad because, you know, I play in a political space. We understand that, but it's the context in which it's used, and it's the derivatives, the algorithms of how they're matched. And then what does that lead to? What is the real impacts on our community and our society? And so if there's a harm principle that we're looking to, then we have to change the paradigm in some way.
Thank you so much. And I was wondering, point of information, and in the US, it's illegal to give out inaccurate information about actual polling, like the day of the election or polling sites. Is that right?
There are that giving inaccurate information about where to vote, inaccurate information that came out in 2016 that told people that they could text their votes, or that the date of the election was a different date than it actually was. All of those things are illegal. And I also, you know, we know just from the First Amendment laws that some of the things that are appearing on Facebook, which are intended, what Jamal talked about, Facebook and other media, that is essentially incitement to violence, that too is illegal. And that is, you do not have a First Amendment right to do those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Anne, thank you. I knew you would know the law on that. Yeah, I think part of what has been so frustrating over the last few years is hearing the same tired excuses all the time from the tech companies, right? So they always talk about the marketplace of ideas. And we know it's not actually a functioning marketplace, because if it were, there would be equal access for all, which there isn't, because a lot of it's connected to what you would paying. And we also, if you don't know who's getting the information, that's not a functioning marketplace either, right? So there's no equality of transmission or broadcasting. So part of what I try to talk about in the paper that I just published today with the Roosevelt Institute is how could we take a real marketplace of ideas and actually apply that online? And one of the things that I started thinking about is, to what extent can we provide, could the tech companies actually give, you know, free access to the posting and transmission, and in some way try to level the playing field? So similar to things like maybe giving political parties or causes free advertising, or a voluntary service doctrine where they actually broadcast news that's relevant and important rather than just, broadcasting whoever is able to game the system or to make it viral. And I don't think that this is that controversial or that difficult. I feel like it's really low-hanging fruit. And since I started thinking about that, Facebook did start actually, Google, first of all, expanded the cards, right? So you get sort of accurate information on the top right when you look at Google. But Facebook has actually started doing this too, right? By giving you your polling place or giving you voter information. And I actually found that in the spring, I found out that my polling place had moved, which I didn't know. So one of my proposals is that they should just sort of expand the quality information that they're giving out. Now, we all know that, Zeynep Tufekci, Tim Wu, everyone's talked about, in a crowded world where there's a lot of information, giving quality information doesn't necessarily mean that it will become salient. But I actually think that more of an effort by them to put quality information out there and some kind of news feed of publicly useful information, I think would be a small thing. Now, I actually ran into Sheryl Sandberg at a conference in February, and so I cornered her and said, "What do you think of my idea?" And of course, what could she say? She said, "Oh, I think it's a great idea." So I don't know if they'll ever do it, but maybe they will. And so that's part of what, Anne, you're smiling. Did you want to come? And you were smiling. I wasn't sure if you were going to say something.
Well, I'm smiling, and I
Mike
was
was smiling.
smiling when Rebecca was talking about the people in the European Union and people thinking that they could get compliance and agreement independently from some of these platforms. As a person who has following these issues and for a long time, and I happen to live kind of down the street from many of the tech companies, I've seen a lot of willingness, and Jamal can probably speak to this as well, given the meetings that were held with the Stop Hate for Profit people with Facebook in particular, and how yes, I think that they are concerned about and their employees are certainly concerned about the impacts that they've had on our democracy, and as well as on spreading hate and vitriol, which they know continues to spread. But I don't think there's been changes in the way that they utilize their algorithms to push out things that are going to help their business. And that is the worrisome part. And Nathalie talked a little bit about this, and I think it's quite true that while they've agreed to do certain things, including when Trump said those things that were clearly false about the election, I think that they haven't devoted resources to doing that. And there's still an enormous amount of hate and misinformation that is occurring on the platform that gets spread in part by their own activities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have questions for Rebecca and Nathalie, but I was wondering if Jamal, did you want to come in and talk at all about the response of Facebook and the meetings that you had? And again, I'd like to encourage the participants to put questions in the Q&A, please.
Yes, I'll actually throw in the chat feature a quote given the story that just broke on Monday in terms of Cambridge Analytica and the public-facing narrative that we're hearing from, and we've gotten this in meetings with Facebook, is that things have changed dramatically since 2016 in terms of them having an army of folks who are, if you will, doing fact checking. You know, the number they put out is 35,000 plus, that they are looking into fully developing a functional political ads library. And that, you know, to the point that you made earlier, they are running on their platform voter information campaigns. But the problem that we're facing is that the misinformation and disinformation is so widespread and unchecked and the funding of the political ads, and now that folks caught on, meaning, you know, you prosecuted, you know, some foreign actors, individuals and companies, so they figured out a pass through. That is, you're almost like trying to counterbalance a giant. And so our argument has been, you know, while these things are nice, even freezing of political ads a week before the election, it doesn't go far enough. And this is not about censorship. This is not a ploy or a play to say get rid of political ads, but it's really to make sure that these ads are listed as such, that they're transparent and we know they exist. And I almost think about Google's response back in 2019, where they said, we will treat all of these ads like we will treat traditional advertising. If it's false, if it has disinformation, misinformation, we won't allow it. And so those are the types of pragmatic standards that we're arguing for, but we don't think the platform is willing to go that far. Actually, they've signaled they're not willing to go that far. And the real question becomes, from a profit standpoint, it's actually not the core of their business model. So it actually speaks to a value system or a value judgment that we are questioning in regards to the integrity of the platform itself, meaning those who are running it.
Yeah, if I could build on that and share some context to the incentives that Facebook in particular is under. You know, I agree with everything that with what both Anne and Jamal said. But also it's important to keep in mind that this is all happening in the context of a company that desperate, and when I say the company, I really mean Mark Zuckerberg, because he really is the dictator at Facebook. Other people have power and influence, but it's really his word at the end of the day. Who desperately wants to be seen as neutral and is just really sensitive to accusations of liberal bias, and is bending over backwards in an overcorrection of that. And that's in large part because of the influence that people like Joel Kaplan and Peter Thiel have over him individually, right? And then the second thing is that it's in Facebook's interest, and I think everyone at the company knows that, to keep the conversation focused, one, at the level of content, and two, on political ads, and not look at the fundamental business model, and not look at the role that data collection and mass surveillance and commercial non-political manipulation, what that does to people, what that does to society, what that does to individuals, the civil rights harms that have been revealed through a series of lawsuits and that Facebook still doesn't have under control, right? It's still way too easy to place ads for jobs and housing and financial services and so on that are targeted in discriminatory ways, right? And that's just not acceptable. But if you add the political context there, right now we have an administration whose policy when it comes to social media is to wage a war on fact checking. That's something that the White House made very explicit in the NTIA, the petition that it instructed the NTIA to file with the FCC. And for those who are drowning in the alphabet soup, I'm sure we can type out what the acronyms are in the chat. There's also several bills in Congress to the same effect, saying that and trying to enforce a standard that if a company does anything that even vaguely resembles editorializing, such as saying this tweet is incorrect, such as saying this information about absentee voting is incorrect, possibly up to including simply sharing what we might think is perfectly neutral, anodyne information about the voting process, that these companies would lose Section 230 protection. And we can go or not go into a rabbit hole of talking about what Section 230 is and is not, and the various ways that it's misinterpreting. But in that context, social media platforms have absolutely every incentive to remain as light touch and as disengaged as possible. Now, if there's a change of administration, it's not at all clear how that will change. Joe Biden has said that he thinks 230 should be abolished. That's a nonsensical position that, frankly, no one else in the Democratic Party holds, to my knowledge. Certainly no one in Congress who's been vocal about it. Tweaking it, yes. Abolishing altogether is nonsensical in my view. But we don't know what position a Biden administration would have on this question.
course, modifying Section 230 is what the Germans did with NetzDG. It was their own version, I would say. But Rebekah can tell us more. Rebekah, several questions have come in that seem to also be perfect for you. There was a question that Jamal partly answered about Twitter's decision to ban political advertising, and Jamal addressed that, but you may want to take that. And then one of our new students, Andrew Carmona, has, I don't know, can you see how bans refocus the way that ads are promoted? What about things like ad blockers? Is that, is that a solution, or is it just another temporary setback to propaganda? Can you see foresee a solution to online misinformation coming from outside the public sector as more extensions are created? I don't know, Andrew, if you're thinking of something like NewsGuard or the Journalism Trust Initiative. And Maurice Jackson is also asking, and I don't know, maybe Jamal or Ann will want to take that. Basically, what can we expect from Congress and policymakers? Is there going to be any follow through? Sorry, I'm asking too many questions. And my other question for Rebekah is, isn't the Digital Services Act in Europe going to get updated under the new maybe one of you can sort of tell the audience about that, and if Europe will be taking more action, and whether that will have an impact globally or be emulated by anybody. I've been looking a little bit at Nigeria and South Africa, and some different countries around the world to see to what extent will people be able to adapt, European regulation. So anyway, Rebekah, that was really long-winded. So what's coming up in Europe, and Andrew Carmona's question about ad blockers. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a lot, Anya. Let me start with the very last question about the Digital Services Act in Europe. Indeed, there is a lot brewing around the DSA in Brussels right now. We had sort of hoped that things would be further along, but then of course COVID hit and it slowed everything down in policy world in Brussels. But still there is the expectation that sometime next year we'll see the draft legislation emerge. And there will still be a long process of debate and consultation, but the expectation is that the Digital Services Act is going to take a much harder line on the platforms than we've seen anywhere else in the world to date. What exactly that will look like is still being negotiated behind the scenes, and I'm privy to some of those conversations, but can't really speak about too much of it publicly at this point. I think we can just expect to see some really more dramatic things happening.
One thing I remember hearing when I was in Brussels, and obviously I don't follow it as closely as you do, is that they were waiting also for the EU's report on how the elections had gone. And then they were going to take action after that came out. But I don't think that report ever came out. I think it may have been delayed because of COVID.
To be honest with you, there are a number of reports that they have been waiting on in various guises. And that were all delayed. A number of those have come out in recent weeks and months, but there are just lots of things happening behind the scenes that are necessarily slowing this down. Then going back to the very beginning, you asked—
One question. Since they're elected government, why the secrecy? Shouldn't they be more, or there isn't secrecy because they're doing consultations? Like what?
Yeah, so there's a public consultation period.
Yeah.
And then, the draft legislation is released, and there's a ton of public debate that happens at the member state level. And, we'll see lots and lots of amendments happen to that before anything would ever actually be adopted at the commission level. So still lots of politics to happen in the meantime.
Can they get it done during this presidency, do you think?
That's certainly the goal.
I know.
I think that, it's too hard to say at this point. I would have, even a few months ago, probably said, yeah, it's still realistic, but it's just hard to say with COVID taking up so much time and attention. The very first question was about the motivations for the Twitter ad ban. And I think one piece of contextual information for everyone to keep in mind when thinking about anything that Twitter does in particular is they are the small fish in this very big pond. Google and Facebook, right, are the big dogs here. Let's mix my animal metaphors. And Twitter actually makes very, when they were running political ads, they made almost no money on the basis of political ads. And what they were facing were increasing costs because of regulatory, even if it was self-regulatory environment under the Code of Practice on disinformation in Europe. There were going to be increasing costs, increasing expenses around complying, right, with any of these measures that were going to come down the pipeline, whether it was in the US or but particularly in Europe. So the easiest thing for them to do is to say, we're just banning them outright. And they did it in a moment where they could get the biggest PR splash for it, because this is not long after Mark Zuckerberg has just basically said, you know, not only are we going to allow political advertising, but we're not going to fact check any of this, right? Even if it's false, it can go ahead and run. And there was so much controversy around that it was really brilliant PR for Twitter to announce in that moment that we're just going to ban political ads, right? Then everybody's applauding Twitter when they were really doing something that was in their financial best interest. So, you know, color me cynical, but I'm pretty confident that those are the larger calculations going on behind the scenes there. One last thing that I want to say that I think builds on something that Nathalie was talking about. If we talk, like, I think we need to be thinking much more carefully about the areas that we're focusing on critiquing the platforms for. So just as she was suggesting that the more we focus on content specifically and content moderation, the more it plays into their business incentives. The same thing with micro-targeting. Micro-targeting, even for Facebook, particularly in the political arena, is a very, very small fraction of the money that they bring in. Instead, the two main drivers of profit around political and issue advertising are in custom audiences and lookalike audiences. Custom audiences are when an advertiser, particularly a political campaign, would bring in a list of people that they target anyway, right? Maybe it's an email list that they put together of general supporters. They bring that into Facebook and they say, send messages to these specific people. Facebook doesn't check who those people are. And then the next thing they might do is say, Facebook, turn this into a lookalike audience, meaning all of the characteristics. Take your algorithms and figure out what are all the underlying characteristics that make other people on the platform like the people we know we already want to target. That makes it very easy for Facebook to say, oh, we're not targeting on the basis, right? We're not doing micro-targeting here. We're not targeting on the basis of income or race or anything else you might want to critique us for. But the customer is coming in and placing the advertisement knowing full well that race is an underlying category in their custom audience, and that it then gets duplicated at a much larger scale in that lookalike audience. So, you know, we have to be thinking in broader terms here and not just focusing on the kind of minutia that actually winds up benefiting the bottom line for the platforms.
And I would just
to be very clear, you're saying that's what they make the most money from, Rebekah? Or Jamal?
From custom, and particularly in the political arena, from custom audiences and lookalike audiences, absolutely. Very, very little of the advertising dollars come from micro-targeting specifically.
I would probably put all of those things under the umbrella of micro-targeting, but then that becomes a semantic discussion. But.
Great, Jamal, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was going to say that when we think about the notion of limiting what I would call, you know, behavioral micro-targeting, for example, you know, to Nathalie's point, there is this broader notion that if you're dumping a list into Facebook and then you're asking them to do an algorithmic match so that you then can have a universe of folks that you're reaching, that is, it's not necessarily a form of micro-targeting in our book, but how it plays out is that you have then created a segment of that universe in which you're targeting, which is why the Cambridge Analytica stuff, I was like, oh, this is, you literally have all this data, you're categorizing folks by perceived behaviors, including race, and some class pieces, and then you're using that as a tool to give them ads that are suppressive in nature. So there is this behavioral match, if you will, that's there. And I know you lifted up Maurice Jackson's question. When we think about the, you know, how political ads fall on the priority lists of members of Congress or policymakers, I would argue it's about the winners and losers. Literally, it depends on who's going to be the victors on November something. Who knows, depending on the mail and the counts, when we will have clear winners and losers. But the reality is that if it's advantageous to those who are in power, then they're not going to put the hammer down and say, we got to solve this problem. And the flip side of that is if it is seen as a tool that has, not been good for progressives or didn't help to usher in a new wave or a blue wave, then it probably will be addressed. And so the sad part is we're still dealing with the notion of power and control at the end of the day. It's not truly about free speech. And so from our perspective, that's why we really want to put this back in the hands of consumers, back in the hands of users, back in the hands of individuals who have the most to lose or to gain, because it's their information, their data, their reality that's being affected.
I don't agree with you completely on that, Jamal, because I've been working some with democracy groups that are working on Biden's, issues as well as others in Congress. And I think what happens is if the Democrats take the Senate, there is going to be more interest in looking at these issues, no matter who's the winner or loser. I mean, it's always been true. Look, I've spent a lot of time at the Federal Election Commission where, it's what you're saying is clearly the case for both sides of the aisle. But I think in this environment that we're now in, there's a lot of desire to make changes in this arena.
I hope you're right. I'm going to follow your optimism.
Okay.
Well, can I just
And
say
I'm usually not an optimist.
Supreme Court, that's huge. That could change, right? So there's something right there. I was wondering if anybody in the audience would like to put in more questions, please do. And if anybody in the panel would like some last words or closing thoughts, I would love to hear them.
I'd like to answer the question from Benguzu. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. That's in the chat. That has to do with companies changing their willingness to change their business models. I think it both depends on the company, and it also depends on what kind of either actual or potential legislation they believe is coming down the pike and may want to get ahead of. So when I say that it depends on the company, so there are companies like Reddit, and for example, that actually do relatively little with micro-targeting, or certainly don't have anything like lookalike audiences and custom lists and so on. On Reddit, you can pretty much only show ads based on either broad geography determined by IP address or by the subreddits that a person actively follows, which is kind of which I see as a self-disclosure of, I am interested in courses or tennis or whatever, right? And I don't see that as a privacy violation or as any kind of a cause for concern, frankly. Similarly with broad geographic targeting, show me restaurants in my city, not the other end of the country. On the other end of the spectrum, you have companies like Facebook that actually do have a very clear ideological commitment to the inherent goodness, as they see it, of the ability to collect any and all information that they can get their hands on and do whatever it is that they want to do with it. And the conversations that we have with different companies throughout that spectrum are really, really different in tone and in content. I would put Twitter and Google somewhere in the middle, in the sense that Google pioneered the surveillance capitalism business model, as Shoshana Zuboff would put it, but at the same time, they're trying to, I do see signs that they're trying to move in other directions. Similarly, Twitter derives something like upwards of 95%. I don't recall the exact figure of their revenue from targeted advertising, but have been looking into other sources of revenue. But at the end of the day, I doubt that any large company is going to be the first mover in moving away from the status quo without the threat of impending regulation motivating them to do that. But I think if and when, and on my good days, I'm hopeful that it's a when, this happens, I think I think companies will find ways to go, for freemium models where you get some amount of, some functionality for free, and then you pay more for other things. Things more advertising-based models that are more based on truly voluntary self-disclosure of information, which is kind of what I described about Reddit. I do have endless faith in businesses' ability to come up with ways to make money, but what government needs to do is draw the line around these are the things that are not okay, and then let business innovate around those lines. But right now, we have not drawn those lines, and we need to do that.
Absolutely right, Nathalie. Any other closing comments from the panelists? Rebekah?
Could I make one quick plug, if I might, for something that's entirely free, a tool that I think a lot of people part of this conversation might find useful. Anya, you actually mentioned very early on this evening, Laura Edelson and her work looking at the Facebook ad library. Her team at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering has built a fantastic tool that they call the Ad Observatory. If you go to adobservatory.org, you can find it. It increases the functionality and the ability to monitor the ad library just a million times. It's a fantastic tool for monitoring particularly political ads down to the race level in the lead up to, and I think actually probably in the aftermath of the election. And my own Institute for Data Democracy and Politics at GW partnered with NYU to add a notifications component to this tool. So especially for journalists, if you want to, right, you don't have a ton of time to be monitoring this, you can set alerts to fit a number of different parameters around spend, changes in topics, and so on. Get automatic notifications anytime anything new is happening in a particular race that you're interested in, and really help hold both the political actors and the platform to account.
I would just want to add, and thank you for this conversation, because it's making me sort of think about the notion of the way in which we choose to regulate, forms of communication. I know we have to take into account the unique technology behind it. I think of the notion of broadcasts and television broadcasters and radio, being able to be fined or penalized for allowing profanities because of being pervasive and invasive, but that same standard not applying to print or newspapers. But when we start to think about at least the struggle in the civil rights community, whether the regulation comes from political ads, meaning coming from governments, or the platforms themselves, our notion is that you can take into account allowing candidates to micro-target ads and to place ads, but at the same time, if we're refraining from fact-checking and from really looking at standards of decency and really looking at what is the truth, if you will, and as a philosophy major, I know we're always searching for the truth, but this notion of a balance, then in some ways we create an environment where false information spreads unchecked. And that ends up being sort of the Achilles heel in all of this debate that we're trying to right size, is how do we make sure that misinformation and disinformation is not the state of play on these platforms, which then puts us in a different state of chaos. And that's really hard. And so I think that's where for us, Stop Hate for Profit, our work is really landing.
Great. Anne, did you have anything closing or? Oh.
This was really good conversation. I really appreciate you putting it on, and I'm looking forward to reading your final version of the document. Clearly, though, and I appreciate what Jamal was just saying, because I see this problem as actually, despite all the conversations that we've had and the things that we're trying to do, that we haven't dealt with the threats to democracy. We just haven't. And I think what's going to happen in 2020 is terrifying, actually. So I think there's some urgency, and you raising the Supreme Court is also worrisome because clearly there are a lot of ways that these mandates could exist, from government requiring them from the platforms. But the fear is that the Supreme Court isn't going to allow them to go forward. When you balance the threats to democracy and the threats to civil rights that we should all be worried about, that are part of the even constitutional values in this country, that might not be upheld. But it shouldn't stop us all from trying to push them forward.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think that, as running the technology and media program at School of International Public Affairs, we're all about policy. And I completely agree with you that in 2016, 2017, you'd go to panels and everybody would say, well, this is terrible, but we don't know how bad it is, right? There was all that academic, well, we're not sure of the causality. We don't really know. We can't jump to conclusions, and we don't want private sector censorship, and we don't want government censorship. And those early years of conversations were extremely frustrating, because I agree with you. And Jamal, we're talking about safeguarding our democracy here, which is already deeply, deeply in danger. So I think that this subject is extraordinarily pressing. COVID and the sort of delays in European regulation, I think are absolutely worrisome, because we need to get good regulations out there fast so that other countries can start to emulate them. And I also agree with Jamal and Nathalie that unless the incentives are changed substantially, the companies aren't going to change as quickly as they need to. So I think it's been a really interesting and productive conversation, again, to have, I think, for you four, some of the sort of greatest minds tackling this problem. Even though I don't know any of you personally, except for Anne, who really helped write my report. So be able to be in a room with you and listen to you after reading your work has just been incredible. And so I want to thank all the panelists. I want to really thank the students, and I want to thank Alan McInerney and all the Columbia people, our Dean Marechal and Nadine Tamamli and Rachel Sala from the communications office, and Susan Storms, who invited our alumni, and the whole crew at Roosevelt Institute, especially Matt Hughes, my former student, who was so supportive. So thank you for this. We're recording it so other people will be able to watch it. And I know everyone probably wants to grab a bite or a drink and then watch the debates. But thank you all for coming. Really very, very grateful to you. And we've got a bunch more events coming up, including something on election finance with the French Institute, with Julia Cagé and Alex Fernandez. We have 2 more events, including our flagship Election Through International Eyes, where we bring foreign correspondents to come and talk about what the hell it's like to cover the United States for the folks back home. We have journalists coming from India and from Kenya and Mexico. And we've got an event with Farai Chidea, Esther Fuchs, and Alex Fernandez on race and gender in the US election. So thanks all for being here. And I hope that the panelists will come back anytime. We're really grateful to you.